Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing for the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
we talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you will be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. On today's episode, we are super excited to have fellow art space resident and painter Michele Yellin on the podcast. So welcome, Michele.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're delighted. We're looking forward to discussing with you the lifestyle of making art, how you've developed your unique painting style, and the career goals that you're working towards, as well as recording a bonus segment on actively choosing career opportunities for our podcast supporters at levelupartist.com.
But real quick, before we dive in, let's go ahead and share a little bit more about you, your background for listeners who may not be familiar with your work quite yet. So Michele Yellin is an artist. He creates color-saturated, expressionistic paintings with subject matter that is abstracted and simplified. She works with acrylic paint, building up layers with a variety of tools to enrich and enliven the surface of the canvas. It is through this process that the painting begins to tell a story, and it is how Michele discovers and reveals her inner life. Her hope is that while her story is singular, it resonates with others. Images about home, connection, family, memory, love, joy, mystery, and dreams are frequent themes in her work. Michele currently lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, with a public-facing studio at Art Space in Raleigh, right down the hall from Adriana and I.
Yeah. And of course, that is the formal introduction to our listeners. But Michele, keeping in mind that most of our listeners perhaps are in the car or they're with their hands dirty in the studio, and are not watching this yet, how would you describe your work to someone who has never seen it before?
Well, gosh, I wrote that great statement. I think that's pretty accurate. But in addition, I'd say, they're vibrant, abstracted, representational. The colors are harmonious and energetic. And overall, I think they're just very happy paintings. That's how I feel about them. I get that a lot from people who come in. So something to uplift my spirit and hopefully others.
Yeah, and there's houses and landscapes and animals. I love the animals.
Yeah.
We have bears and deer and all kinds of good stuff in there. Birds.
Got a pelican going right now. And a
Mm,
horse. And a horse. Yeah.
I love it. Embracing that summer energy on the beach.
Well, I was just down in Key West, or in the Keys rather, and out at the beach, and they have such beautiful birds, wading birds there. So actually tracked what it was I saw and said, oh, I want to see if that shows up in the painting. So
I
Nice.
love it. I love it. Which we'll dive into your style a little bit in a minute, but I am curious, when did you first feel like you could call yourself a proper artist? Has this been something always in your life?
it has. And I think about the term proper artist or artist in general. And, we all did art as kids, and a lot of us loved it. Most of us did
Mhm.
love to draw and paint whatever was available. And then as I got older, it seemed like only certain people could call themselves artists. And when I was growing up, predominantly, and still is, men are what you see most of their work to this day. Looking back at my age now, I would say I've always been an artist, and anybody who makes art is an artist. It doesn't have to be that you're selling it, that you're a professional artist. If you make art, you are an artist. So I think people like to get into the nitty gritty of like, oh, if you're professional, that makes you an artist. If you're selling your work, that makes you an artist. No, that just means you're selling your work. People never sell their work. They work their whole lives making huge bodies of work, and they're artists. So in retrospect, I've always been an artist, but I would not have said that, along the way.
Yeah, that's very fair. And I love that distinction between yes, there are artists who sell their work and there are artists who don't sell their work. That's not a defining factor of truly being an artist. And I know you have shared with visitors to your studio, but also in other interviews. I want to dive in a little bit to you actually lived over in Europe growing up.
I did. I moved there on my 11th birthday. And
What a birthday! Big
well,
adventure.
yes, and you would think that that's a heck of a present, and it is. But I did not have a cake. And so when I was in my 30s, my mother finally made me a birthday cake, not on my birthday, to make up for that. Dad always said, "Well, I took you on the last sailing of the SS France on your birthday," which was monumental. I mean, I was a little kid. And I said, "But it was my brother's birth, not their birthdays, and you brought them, so I don't."
Right.
But yeah, we
You're like,
moved.
I'm 11. I want a birthday cake and balloons.
Right, I want the
Please.
deal. But yes, my dad was with IBM, so we moved overseas, right outside of Paris, and lived there for 4 years. And with school, we went to a lot of museums, and I was just recently back in France for the first time since I was a kid, and I did not go to the Louvre. We went there a lot on trips and everything, and so as a kid, I was a little bit like, I don't want to say dismissive of it, but it's not as important as an adult to me.
Yeah.
And we traveled a lot. And I did mention this in one of my bios, is that the Van Gogh Museum had just opened in Amsterdam. And my dad he loved Holland. And he took us to the Van Gogh Museum. And I think he had a poster or maybe coasters. I can't remember what, but I remember seeing the work and just like being wowed by it way more than anything I'd seen in the Louvre, because you were looking at more traditional work there. And I talked to one of my brothers about this recently. He has no memory of that trip. And I'm like, it was monumental. But yeah, I think anybody moving overseas, it changes your perspective entirely. But I got exposed to a lot of really great art in a way that I didn't appreciate at the time. It was just another field trip. So
Yeah, I love that story.
yeah.
You're reminding me of like the first time that I saw a Van Gogh exhibition in person. It was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art
Mhm.
about, oh my gosh, more than 10 years ago now, maybe 15 years ago. And just having that shock of like, being inches away, being told to step away, and not breathe on the painting. But there's something else too. Like in my case, obviously I didn't have to go overseas. I just went several states over, but I still think it has a similar effect of the going elsewhere and then seeing somebody's work in a different light, not just seeing it on the internet or seeing what your local museum always carries, which is like you said, it's not that it's not worth less, but it's also like, especially when we're younger, we also don't have that what's it called? Like distinction either of like, okay, yeah, that's important and looks cool. And, like it's not like we don't have context as to what these folks went through. Like Van Gogh is a great example, right? Mental health issues to the hilt, right? All the kind of things he went through, all the jobs he went through, and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And then seeing it as an adult and seeing the body of work that still resulted out of it. Monet's another one. Are you serious? Painting from his bed with a broomstick? It just kind of like, oof. I think it's a little different, but I do still think obviously it's important. And I love the fact that your parents took you because that's you know, an early look at it. And that could be where some of those first influences and interests could
Right.
really be seated. Especially in terms of subject matter or colors or texture or thing like that. So chef's kiss. I love all that. Now, speaking of, how did you develop your unique style and technique? I know,
Um,
loaded question.
that's loaded. Well, I just like anybody else. I just did it like anybody. Yeah, I've
Well, you
always
didn't, did you go to art school?
I got my bachelor's, my BFA in studio art, and focused a lot on sculpture for some reason. I think because my advisor was a sculpting teacher. So I learned to paint there a little bit. And so let me think. And so I've always been painting, and then I had a couple of children, and while they were young, I just worked in pen and ink and watercolor because you got to be able to leave your brushes in the water and not worry about them. You can just walk away. You don't have to clean up. Um, and I guess it's maybe 20 years ago, I started getting more serious about working on canvas again because they were getting older. I think while I was working on watercolors, I did occasionally do an oil if when I had a separate place away from them. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to shut that up. Um,
That's okay. We
so,
can barely hear it.
right. So I got back into acrylics like 20 years ago, and I eventually, really what got me going on my current style, I found this great tool called, it's a rubber blade. It's a color shaper. And do things with that I couldn't do with brushes. And I love that tool. To this day, I still use it for most of the painting. I mean, I will use some brush work for sure, but the color shaper, you can remove paint and add paint in really beautiful ways and layer, and you get these crisp edges, which show up a lot in my work. And also when you drag it across the canvas, it'll leave paint in different areas because I have textured canvases. So you get this kind of uneven effect with the color, which I find it very rich looking.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I was, a friend of mine was demonstrating it, and I thought, I don't need to look at that. I'm happy with what I'm doing. And then she demonstrated it again a few weeks ago for other people. I thought, well, I'll just go look. And it changed my painting completely. So that was maybe 10 years ago, I guess. So, and I like it. I'm sticking with it. I would be interested in other techniques, but I keep going back to that.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if I may share this with our listeners, is like if anybody that's local to us goes by Michelle's studio while she has a work in progress, it looks like a crazy party before you know what's going on. It's fantastic. I mean, people use different names for it. One of the names I've used, please correct me if you'd like to use a different term. I've heard some people call it like intuitive painting, at least how it starts.
Yeah,
And you can have music, you can dance, like it literally frees you up from that, that it takes away those required steps of you have to do a drawing and then a painting study and then a thing and then a quadrant. Like it takes all that away and it's like no, you get to like freely express yourself, make a hot mess, who cares, and then you can step back and then you can start being like, okay, what does this painting want to become, if you
that's
will. I know
that's
I took some classes and not yours, not quite your style, a similar, kind
yes.
of idea, and it was so liberating. It was so like it was one of those like, oh, you don't have to do it the way other people did it back in the day for hundreds of years. There's other ways, especially for the neurodivergent like myself, that is a lot more like fun and just liberating. So I love that. But
Yeah,
I do want to share that in case somebody's like passing by your studio going, but there's a lot going on in there. It's like, no, she's
yeah.
gonna tighten that up.
I think intuitive painting is a good way to put it, and I've heard other artists put it that way. And of course, like once you get into your painting, it's all intuitive because you're feeling and you're responding to how you're feeling on the canvas. But that idea of, like you said, start by making a big mess, and I love that. And it's a way to clean my palette up, or just play, 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 and it is very freeing. That's a very fun part of the experience. And it's like the beginning, it's like the baby painting and how you love a baby because they're full of possibility, and you've got to raise it, and that's a challenge. But yeah, there's still a lot of play, and I like to keep, if I can, keep as much of that underpainting there as I can because I love what's in there, but I just keep going until I love every little bit of it. So
I
Same.
love it. And for any of our listeners, not the ones that are driving, keep your eyes on the road. But if you are in your studio, after you listen to today's episode, I'm going to shamelessly plug another interview Michelle did with the North Carolina Museum of Art that was fantastic, mainly focused on the creative process. She shows like multiple pieces in progress, so you really can see what we're talking about here if you are not able to visit her studio in person to see the start of a painting, the middle, the end, to see all these tools that we're referencing. So I definitely suggest that one. It's a great watch.
Thanks.
Yeah, but I am curious too, kind of thinking more of the logistics side for the career-minded artists, thinking about not just the work you make, but the process in which you make it. So how often do you make art and where does that typically take place?
So I work half the week typically at Art Space. I'd like to go in 3 days a week as I live in Chapel Hill. And so usually I come in during the week and work all day, stay overnight in Wake County, and then work the next day. And then I like to be in there on Saturdays. And then I share a studio at home here in Chapel Hill with another fantastic artist, Jane Filer. And I have my easel set up there at all times. So I would say I probably touch a canvas 6 days a week. And that doesn't mean I'm in there 8 hours a day. Though there are those days, you girls know, where you got a deadline and you are at it every day, all day long. But if I can go in and just draw something that I noticed, or just sit and look at a painting, I mean, if it's not 7 days, certainly 6 days. I want to actively give myself one day off a week to be
Mhm.
that. Like, it's okay, Michelle, you don't have to do this every minute. But I typically have, like right now, I would guess I have probably 8 or 9 paintings started. And maybe one is getting close, maybe two are getting close. A lot of them are in the beginning stages, but I like to have a lot going at once so that
Yeah.
if I am stuck and frustrated, set it aside, pull out something else, work on that. And as you probably know, once you pull it out again, you haven't been looking at it changes it completely. And you might have been very dissatisfied when you left it off, but now you can see like, oh, there's some really great things happening there. So I do like that, keeping multiples going. I don't ever feel like I just need to do one and finish it because it's just too frustrating.
Totally understandable. And
Oh,
yeah, if you've seen Adriana and I's studio, we work kind of very similarly, especially just the logistics of even working in acrylic, which dries relatively quickly. There's still a point of, okay, when I have to wait 5, 10 minutes for this layer to dry before I can add another. So I already have paint on my palette knife. Give me another panel. I'm adding some. So it also helps with, I mean, the larger conversations of a cohesive series. You're using a similar palette. So both logistically, but also from a creative development standpoint, it can be very helpful. But real quick, I am a quick follow up to that question before we move on. What advice would you have for artists who are maybe struggling to find time in their practice? I know you mentioned working in different materials in the past based off the phase of life you're in. But what advice would you have those artists who feel like they can't commit 5, 6, 7 days a week to their creative practice?
So I would recommend, and I probably told you all this many years ago, and you actually run one. It's the Co-Create, which
Mhm.
you all do this, I think, once a month, where people can come in with their
mm-hmm.
material and work on their own projects, and you can see what other people are doing. That's not a huge commitment of time at all. That's just once a month. And it's really not going to be enough to build your practice, but it's something. And there are other organizations that are doing open studio in that same kind of way. It's a small fee. You can go in and work on your project. And I have always found that everybody who attends these are so gracious about how they're getting the effects they're getting and what they're doing. They're just so happy to share. And what I most commonly would hear and say myself is somebody would come around to look, they're like, well, I'm in the middle of this. Like, don't judge this, but this is what I'm doing. There's a lot of that. And then also, it's side by side with that. And I don't do it all the time. In fact, it's just at certain periods of my life, I will go and do the life drawing sessions. And I know they have them at the Eno Mill up in Hillsborough. I think at Anchor Light, but I'm not sure.
Yes, they do.
Um, but those kind of drop-in things where you're not necessarily looking for instruction, um, those are things that you can do as part of part of your week. Like, oh, on that Saturday, this is when I go to co-create. Um, find those little things to do. And if also, I would say this, it seems like a lot of artists I know, they have artist friends, and I often, or occasionally, depending on what time of the year it is, I will paint with other people in their studio for a few
Hmm.
hours, or we'll go someplace and all bring our stuff and paint for a few days together. And that's great. You get that energy from other people, and that's wonderful. And I think that's all about being in a space with other artists, which is terrific. But as we all know, most of our work has to be done while we're alone. So we're not
Mm,
distracted. And that kind of brings up a tricky thing for a lot of people where they don't necessarily have space in their personal space.
Hmm.
Uh, so one thing a person could do is try to get creative and dedicate a space. I know a woman who's a little older than me, and she has her easel set up in her bedroom, which I don't think I could tolerate that personally, but I don't have to. All I know is that there was one period of time in my life since I got out of college where I didn't have a studio in the house that I could paint in. And I did draw some, but I really didn't feel like I had a place I could get messy. And it's good to find that. And so if you can't do it in your own house, sometimes there's people who are like, well, I've got this room in my garage. I have one friend, she's had studios all over Raleigh in little random odd places. And people were happy to rent out a little space to her for very little because they were just happy to help out an artist. So it takes some energy and curiosity and willingness to ask people, would they be willing to let you do that? But if it's important to you, you can find a way, I think.
Nice. I
love
love that
that.
so much. Yeah, especially that whole idea too of like, I think at some point or another, most of us that start with the whole taking over a little corner of the kitchen or the dining room, and then it moves on to if you have a secondary best bedroom or a storage space or even a closet, that thing will get transformed. And
Yes.
I mean, watercolors are a lot easier to clean up, but acrylics and oils, well, it requires a little bit of a different logistic, but it's possible. But I love
Yeah.
that idea too of like sharing with others. And then also things like whether it's like co-create that we co-host or whether it's like exchanging with other artists, that also opens the door to if they're working in different materials. This is something I love about art space. You can literally say like, "Hey, does anybody have oil sticks? I'm curious to try them. I don't want to invest in them yet. Does anybody have one that I can, just kind of play around with?" And those kind of groups is the same kind of thing. Like you can literally experiment or even see somebody else as they use those materials and then just be like, kind of like the spatula example you gave with the color movers and things like that, like the rubber scrapers, where you're just like, until you saw somebody else in action with it, it didn't necessarily click like saying watching a YouTube video. Like sometimes
Right.
you need to watch it in real time with somebody else and go, what is that? And can I try it? So
Mhm.
yeah, no, I love all those ideas, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think one thing too, like a two tie between both of those is that mindset shift, right? Whether it's exploring a new medium or like defining what your studio space is, or finding the time for your creative practice, even if one co-create session or one live drawing session a month isn't necessarily going to be profound in developing a body of work, right? But it's at least one thing that I found, especially early on, is that recommitment to this is something that's important to me, and I am going to continue to prioritize it. Even if I'm in the thick of life right now, giving a lot of myself, my time to other people, this is the one thing that I'm saying, no, this is a priority. And when I have more time, I will increase the amount of time. Same thing with the studio space, being like, you don't necessarily need to have a wonderful open to the public studio in downtown Raleigh, even though it is absolutely amazing. And we are all very fortunate every day to have that opportunity. It's one of those, okay, like this 4-foot desk in the corner of my living room, this is my studio. And I think even the verbiage of calling it, this is my studio space, is a big hurdle for a lot of artists to come over. They're like, oh, well, no, like that's just like a little table that I do little craft things on. Be like, no, this is my studio. Each time you're able to maybe upgrade it or add to it, you can. But I think also how we talk about these things and our mindset around it is super important because yeah, I loved what you said, Michelle, about having to have one space in your own space that you can call your own. Even if it's a one table, even if it's a Tupperware bin that you put in the closet every time you have to set things up, that's at least you're creating some space for your creative practice. So I absolutely love that.
Oh yeah,
It's
absolutely.
important. It's very important. And I really think if you can even if you can leave it out, that to me has always been the biggest thing is to be able to have your artwork out on a table. Like you said, even if it's like a 4-foot table, that it's out. So then as you're walking by, it draws you in. So,
Mhm.
and I think
It's staring you down.
a lot of people think, well, no, I shouldn't be dedicating that space. Yes, you should. It's your house.
Hmm.
You live there, your apartment, whatever. You get to decide, of course, along with your people you live with, but it's important to honor that. It's so good for you.
Hmm. Kind of like those folks that then do instruments and they have like a music room or they'll have a music corner, or maybe they're into baking and they have like all these baking appliances that they have to put away the rest of the time. But when they come out, they can express themselves creatively, whether it's through music or cooking or whatnot. It's like you need to honor yourself in the same way. Like art's the same, like if it's something that calls to you, give it the same amount of love. It's just
Yeah.
as important. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Now, Michelle, what would you say is the most fulfilling part about being an artist?
I think that I get to draw and paint for a living. It's awesome. Um, it's I feel really lucky with my whole life that like that's what I get to do to make a living. And also and being an art space is a good point. I love it when people come into my studio, people that are younger or less advanced with their art, and they're looking for ways to move forward, and or parents looking for classes for their kids. I love that. That is super fulfilling to me that I get to give them ideas and send them in directions so that kid who, well, I don't know, but for a lot of us, like art was a place where we could have some success and feel free. And that I could help direct people into, classes and co-creating activities and all that. That I have to say, like, that probably is the most fulfilling thing. Well, it's tied, it's hand in hand, right? Because you got to make a living. So,
Yeah, yeah, you do. But this definitely brings back some flashback memories for us because it's like back before I was still in corporate, Jackie was still working at I think it was a trophy company, an awards company,
Mhm.
at the time, and neither one of us were at art space. And I remember us visiting you, and you were so gracious with us and all them questions. Um, but like you were willing to say, yes, this is what I do for a living. And yes, like any other job, it comes with some challenges, but also like if this is what really calls to you, do it. Life's too short, pursue it. Like you will figure it out. And I remember like, at least for me in my own journey, I wasn't ready to leave corporate until I had heard. Now this is like me reassurance wise, like this is how I operate. I needed enough empirical proof, so to speak, that there were artists in our area, not in New York, not in California, but artists in our area that could make a living with their art, and not necessarily like just photo represent or photorealistic or ultra representational portrait stuff or whatever, but like that there was actually space for abstract art as well, which is what I was interested in the most. And you were always so generous with us. Like we would both come in like
I love that.
which was always
Every
like a good
first
time.
Friday.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's part of our job at Art Space. And I have
It is.
had other people like been in your shoes, then gone into Art Space and, had some good conversations like, okay, I am not crazy just because that man at the Employment Security Commission said I majored in a nice hobby. Thank you very much, you are, you know, um, and like you said, life's too short,
Mhm.
you want to spend your time doing something that you believe in. And that I have customers, I think it was somebody bought one of my first acrylic paintings, one of the early ones. Whenever I would see them, they always say, I see that painting every morning. It makes me happy. It's like, okay, I've done my job.
Yes, you
Oh,
have. Yeah, whenever you first have that one person that comes in and it's like their eyes are glittering. They're stars. I don't know, you feel like they're about to start crying. And especially for the more non-objective abstract styles, when they read the painting and they didn't even see the title yet. They're like, "Oh, this painting makes me feel like blank, 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 blank." And when that's in alignment with what you were trying to express or at least portray through the painting, even if it's indirectly and just in the background layers nobody can see, and somebody can almost read that, feel that, like it radiates over, like they can translate it. Oh, chef's kiss. There it is. It's just that moment of like connection. It's all about connection and
like
just
magic.
being able to like spread that joy forward. It's just,
Mhm.
sorry, I'm gonna get
Yeah.
emotional.
No, it's true. It's like magic.
It really is. And I think that's a big part, both from connecting a future collector to the painting that they were kind of destined to have in that magical moment, but also to your point, making connections with other artists in the community. And I think a big thing of being an artist is that confidence in yourself and believing that your voice matters, that your work needs to be shown out in the world. And that is a big hurdle for a lot of artists to come over. And so I definitely agree. I think as artists at Art Space or just any fellow community member, not that you need or we need to like give artists permission to be like, you can do this, but it definitely doesn't hurt, right? It helps to show the examples of this is what is possible because they aren't always modeled for other artists. So I know for like Adriana and I, the many years ago when we'd come to Art Space just with like bright eyes, being like, wow, like this is our goal in our creative careers to have studio spaces here. And so it's really cool to be able to share that forward with other artists.
Yeah.
And thank you for doing that with us.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
But it does bring up another question, though. I am curious. Is there something you wish you have done for your art career that you haven't gotten to yet?
Something I've done, I think what I want to do next is I want to get back and doing some 3D work. And
Mm.
I'm looking at classes right now. So that's something I am interested in getting back into. I would like to do some 3D work, and I don't know if that's in clay or in wood. But I like working in 3 dimensions. And to have it relate to my paintings as well. So that's probably the next direction I'll go in, but I can't imagine that I will stop doing my canvases because I love doing those.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Didn't you
definitely
used to have
something
a
that's
bird?
fun.
Hmm?
Oh, sorry. Didn't you used to have a bird in your studio? Like a
Um,
crow or a raven that you had
yeah, I
made
used
and
to
stuff?
do the folk art birds, which were awesome.
That's
They
fun.
were, they were out of like one by wood and found objects. And that whole business started out of using people's leftover wood from projects totally, and sticks and bottle caps and buttons. And it was, I don't know that I spent any money except on paint for a long time. But yeah, that was really fun. But I would like to get into like more bigger. That's
Yes.
phrase, but I'd like to get into something larger, more complex. Yeah.
Ooh, we all love bigger and more complex. Even if
Yeah.
it's harder to go, where's that gonna go? We'll figure it out later.
Right.
I think
Now, do
especially
you
as
have,
artists, when you have a relatively defined style, obviously open to evolving or different subject matter, it's really fun to your point, like having a new I don't know, creative outlet that still relates to those paintings. I know that's something that Adrienne and I are also actively exploring. And it's fun to be like, okay, not that the paintings that we make are a recipe by any means, they're still ever evolving, but it's kind of like, well, what if there's this whole new variable, not just color, not just texture, not just the traditional design components, but adding 3D space to it? It's a really fun challenge as an artist. So I'm excited to see an exhibition full of your paintings and sculptures in the middle of the room. It'll be
Yeah.
fun.
And I think, we speak to this like how you talked about, asked me how I developed my style, but I think, and you'll probably see this in your own work, if you laid it all out from when you first started doing art, kind of in a more serious way, not just like in kindergarten, but you were serious, of course we were, you can see the voice developing in different mediums. And I think it's not until you get to a certain point that you can look back and really, really see that. And again, like you said, keep going. Where's it going to go next?
It's the only way to evolve it anyways. Gotta
Right.
make 100 not so great ones to get to the good stuff. And then
That's
over the years that number's a little smaller, but you'll still go through some stuff. But that's where the breakthroughs come from anyway. So
right.
no, I absolutely love that. Now, for folks out there, that might be in maybe some of their earlier um phases of their career, emerging or maybe even going into intermediate. Do you have any tips for them to cultivate a creative community and or collector base, aka finding your people, as they say?
Okay, so we talked a little bit about community already, and that I think we develop with going to, open studio, and also by taking classes. You'll meet people there. There's different places like Elizabeth City, for example, they do a splash studio artist event once a year where you can go and paint for the week and connect with other artists there. A lot of Orange County and Wake County people, artists go out there. And looking for those kinds of things. I know there's a plein air painting event in Orange County in October. So I think, once you're interested in pursuing these places where you can work collectively. And also Scott Rank, I think his name, he does the urban sketching. That's a
Hmm.
Hmm.
way to connect with people too. So then when it gets to collectors, now that's a different kettle of fish altogether. So it's important to have your work out and have it be seen. And whenever I'm talking to an artist who's starting to think about showing their work, I encourage them to think about alternative spaces rather than trying to get into a gallery because typically you have to have some work under your belt for that quite a bit. And galleries are not always the way to go. So it's a different kind of world now. But using libraries or restaurants, those have been good. And what else? Pop-ups. I was
Art
in
councils
art
have
councils.
calls too.
I was in a cooperative art gallery up in Hillsborough for 10 years, and it was great. I got a lot of collectors that way. It was a beautiful space. We all shared the work of running the gallery. It was everybody had to do their part. Now, of course, working with a group of people can be challenging because not everybody wants to do their share. But as far as people saying, well, there's mostly older people having these galleries now, if you want to, you can do it too. It's not that complicated. It's just a matter of talking to people who've done it and like, what is the most helpful way to do that? But it is important in my mind, although I guess a lot of people sell their work online. I would have never bought a painting online. I would want to see it in person. I think the work, it's so much deeper and richer and more interesting when you see it in person. I think a little snapshot of it just does not convey the depth of feeling that you get from it. So to me, it's important that you get your work in front of people's eyes. And like you said, councils and
Hmm.
Pollen Art Center in Sertoma and Raleigh, for example, they have exhibits. A lot of art centers, they're always looking. If you go onto the cafe site, or any of any of your city sites for arts and culture, a lot of them have calls for artists, and try to get in. Why not? But I think some people think, oh, I don't want to put my work in a restaurant. I know a woman, like, she sells regularly out of a local restaurant, regularly. She's always bringing new pieces in. So I'd encourage people to think outside of the box and don't just think, I got to have a gallery. Yeah, it's nice to have a gallery. They take 50% typically. And
Hmm. Hmm.
that's not always easy to swallow, but part of the deal is wherever you show your work, you typically have to pay to play. And that's
Hmm.
not always true. Like if you're showing in a library or in a cafe or restaurant, a lot of times they won't, but they're not really promoting you in the same way. So
Exactly. It's a
there's
trade-off.
a lot of things to balance there, but don't be afraid to have a pop-up. There's lots of empty
Hmm.
spaces. Promote the heck out of it. Use all the tools, you know.
Yeah. And like you said, if you're building that community, then also that means with other artists, you can be like, hey, did you hear about this group show application coming up? And,
Right.
exchange opportunities, or even say, hey, let's put our money together and like rent the space. And for First Friday, we're going to have like our own mini exhibition or things like that. So there's definitely ways. So lots of gems there. So for those of you that might be on the earlier stages of your artist career, definitely some good ideas there to experiment. Now, next up, Michelle, we love to ask all our guests how they define success, but we're going to take a quick break to put a word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by our Level Up Artist courses.
We understand that life as a modern artist can be both exciting and overwhelming. Plus, there's a lot of information out there. So, what do visual artists actually need?
We've spent countless hours of trial and error, weeding through tons of information to find the gold, so you don't have to waste your time going down those endless rabbit holes.
In addition to weekly calls, we have created video course modules to cover everything from artist documents to exhibition prep, social media to technology, sales strategies, artist mindset, PDF resources, templates, and so much more.
Ready to get started? Head on over to levelupartists.com to learn more, get immediate access, and level up your career today.
Welcome back, everybody. So let's dive right in. Michelle, how do you define success as an artist?
That is a very interesting question. And I had a woman come into my studio a couple of years ago with her 4 children, sat them down on the sofa, and her partner was there. She asked me to tell her kids this. And I thought, success to me is that I am able to work as an artist, that I'm able to sell my work, show my work, sell my work, and support myself as an artist. It's as simple as that. I have the freedom to live a creative life, for which I'm very grateful. I know it's not true for everybody. We all want to be able to make a living, and I won't say it's easy. There's times when the work sells and other times it doesn't. But the fact that I get to draw and paint for a living, that's success.
So true. I love it. Well, what is one piece of advice that you wish you had heard before you got started on your creative journey?
Well, that's a good one. One piece of advice, I guess it would be, don't worry. It's all going to be fine. And the road is long, and try different things. Don't be afraid to just try different things. Also, if I was going to give serious advice to somebody who's like young, they want to start their career, also take a business class.
Yes.
That is super important. And probably also a marketing class in there. Those are important things that, I've learned over the time. I'm not so great about the marketing as I should be, but I do it. And the business part, it's so important.
That's solid as it gets. Yeah, Jackie and I are definitely the sort that when people are like, oh, yeah, I'm thinking about doing a bachelor's degree, or they're in the middle of it, any suggestions like to make a living? And we're like, business class, whether it's like small business, entrepreneurship, solopreneurship, whatever they call it. And if the school doesn't have it, or it's outside of the budget to do through the school, then there's things like the Small Business Administration that has and the community colleges have all kinds of either cheap or sometimes free courses that you can take on at least the basics of the business side. Because it's like, if you don't know where that money's going, then yeah, that can be a little troublesome.
Yeah,
So
we
it's
need,
good to
yeah,
at least have the basics of it. You don't have to be a business expert, you don't have to be a marketing expert, but knowing the basics is helpful. Even if you work with a gallery that's taking care of a lot of that for you, you still need to know because it's like driving. How do you know if the person you're a passenger for is good or bad if you've never driven? And they
right.
feel safe. That doesn't mean they're following the rules, right? Until you learn yourself. It's the same way. It's like you need to at least know the basics of it. So, absolutely love that.
I'd like to respond to what you're saying there. When you're looking at a gallery, just to add a tidbit of wisdom, when you're looking at a gallery, you get approached by one or you're approaching one and they say, oh yeah, we'd love to show you work. Get in touch with another artist or two that's being represented and see what their relationship is like. And does the gallery owner pay? Do they pay on time? That is critical. So don't be afraid to reach out to other artists in that gallery and say, well, how do you feel about your relationship with the gallery?
Hmm. And how many paintings are they asking you to crank out? And is it the same? And you're
Right.
just making repetitions. I've heard that one. Like
Yeah.
make 40 of the same, essentially. No, thank you. Moving on. Um,
It's for some people, though. It does
oh, some
actually work
people
for
love.
some people.
Yeah.
So more power to them.
Mhm.
Yep. No, that's
Yeah.
great. Hey, every kind of artist, every flavor, but yeah, important questions. I love the idea too. Definitely have to ask others. And always with a grain of salt, of course, You're
Mhm.
gonna get the whole flavor. But if they all say, yeah, they never pay on time, or they paid me less, or they never told me inventory was, yeah, red flags. It's a thing. It's still managed by humans,
Yeah.
and humans come in all flavors. It's not the be
Yeah.
all end all. And then there's all kinds of galleries, which we do have a podcast episode where we talk about the different types of galleries. So, guys, please go ahead and check that out. Now, getting back to track. If someone randomly hands you $100, what would you splurge on or invest in? Has to be something that brings you joy and relates to your art or business.
So I thought about that. I had two answers. First, I would probably want to buy a piece of art, but what I would probably do is invest it in a class because that's what I want to do right now. And then usually take a class or two, I don't know, maybe one a year or one every other year just to do something different. But I think, once you invest that money in that class, you're going to get more out of it and I'm not good with learning stuff on the computer. I feel so satisfied having watched them do it. It's like, okay, we're done here. It's different. So I would invest in another class.
I love that. I feel like that kind of the in-person workshops online is wonderful from an accessibility standpoint, and you can kind of do it on your own time. But there
Yeah.
definitely is something magical about being in a space physically with other artists, like we were talking about earlier, being able to physically touch the materials. You learn a lot from classes outside of what the actual curriculum is too. You're like, "Ooh, where'd you get that brush? What about this? Like, I've never seen that tool before." So it's all those little things and the community too. So I love that idea. Now, Michelle, before we wrap up and let you get to the rest of your day, what exciting projects do you have coming up that our listeners should know about?
Let's see, exciting projects. Well, let's see. I don't know that I really have any exciting projects. I'm just working away on a body of work because I am in the midst of applying to galleries.
Exciting.
I just put some work up at the Frank Gallery in
Yes.
Scarborough. Also, even though it's early, we do the studio tour out here in Orange County, first 2 weekends in November, and that's what, 6 months away. But it's a big event. Orange County has a ton of artists. I think there's probably 95 artists on this tour, and it's well attended. People come far and wide. So, I guess I'm working on work for that. And then I'm hoping to be teaching my abstract painting class to high schoolers at Art Space at the beginning of the summer.
Yes.
9 through 12. We had a great time last year. But it's very shortly after school lets out. So registration numbers have not been great. I understand now that parents want to take their kids when they get out of school and leave town and go on vacation. So
why would they want to do that? That's
they can
crazy.
take my class. It's so fun. So that's what's going on right now. And like I said, I'm looking at the 3D thing. In fact, when we get done here, I'm going over to my workbench, which has the saws in it, and I'm going to dismantle a piece of art I made a couple of years ago and see about
I love it. I see you with the protective eyewear and like a big chainsaw, just like chopping something up. I love it. Well, for our listeners, how can they stay in touch with you after they listen to today's episode to stay up to date on your incredible sculptures coming and all of these wonderful events?
Well, I have a website, which is micheleyellin.com, and I'm in the midst of doing a newer one so that they could sign up for my newsletter. But my contact information is on my website, and it's Michele with 1 L. And I'm happy to add them to my newsletter. I like to send that out regularly and let them know what I'm doing.
Perfect. And we'll make sure to link everything in the show notes. And then we would love if you would stay with us a few extra minutes so that we may discuss actively choosing career opportunities on a bonus segment for our podcast supporters. So that'd be cool.
Okay.
Excellent. In the meantime, for our listeners, if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at Mayart across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. You can also visit levelupartists.com to hear the rest of this conversation and become one of our podcast supporters.
This will give you access to amazing off-the-record conversations like we're about to have, the artist community platform, and it helps to keep the podcast going.
Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.